Most American history textbooks explain that the XYZ Affair involves an event where dishonorable French agents approach American diplomats sent there to negotiate peace and ask them for a bribe before continuing on with negotiations. But did you know about the high-ranking U.S. official that actually meddled and undermined this American diplomatic mission for peace? Or about how American party politics actually played a significant role in how things turned out? And many American history textbooks actually don't explain much of the European political context of the time, which is what explains so much of why the French behaved in the way that they did. So, who are the true heroes and who are the true villains in this story? Well, that's what we're going to dive into today. Join me as we uncover some of the shocking secrets around the XYZ Affair. Before we dive into the nitty-gritty, let's go ahead and get a quick overview of this whole event. In the late 1790s, the United States and France had a very tense diplomatic relationship. 3 American diplomats were sent to France to negotiate peace. However, they were met by suspicious French agents who asked them for a bribe before they could even go on with the negotiations. This demand led to outrage and a political scandal in the United States and increased the tension between the two nations. The affair ultimately led to the creation of the U.S. Navy and the Quasi-War, a limited naval conflict between the United States and France. It also led to the passing of the calamitous Alien and Sedition Acts in the United States. Now that we have a bird's eye view of the whole event, let's go ahead and dive into it deeper and get the background and context. In order to really understand the XYZ Affair, it's really important to understand the politics of the 18th century. At the time, the United States was a young nation and it was still working hard to establish itself on the world stage. Meanwhile, Europe was a much older and established region with its own established set of practices, alliances, and conflicts. Let's look at what was happening in Europe around the time of the XYZ Affair. In 1789, the French Revolution began in France. The French people executed their king and a new government took power. Many European monarchs were afraid that this French Revolution threatened the balance of power in Europe, and so they declared war against the new French Republic. As a result, France was at war against many Western European countries at this time, including Austria, Prussia, Spain, Portugal, and finally Great Britain. However, despite having so many nations against them, by the late 1790s, France actually dominated much of Western Europe. They won many decisive battles and took over much of their enemies' territories. For example, they invaded and took over Belgium and the left bank of the Rhine. Italy, Switzerland, and the Netherlands also became their client states, which means that these countries became politically and economically subordinate to France. So France seemed to be on top of the world. However, these wars were very expensive and they were actually taking their toll on the French treasury. The Directory, which was the new ruling power in France, was in need of money by 1797. So that's just a brief and oversimplified overview of things that were happening in Europe around the time of the XYZ Affair. By the way, if you're finding this video helpful so far, please go ahead and hit like and subscribe so that you can be notified when more new videos like this come out. Thank you. So now that we've done an overview of Europe at this time, let's go ahead and look a little bit closer at the relationship between France and the United States. So if we go back a couple of decades from this time, in 1778, while the American Revolution was going on and they were fighting together against Great Britain, France and the United States signed military and commercial treaties agreeing to become official allies against Great Britain, and they also granted each other the status of most favored nation when it came to trading. This means that they would be granted all the best trading privileges that the other country could offer. Fast forward a decade or so later, Great Britain declared war against France because the French people had just deposed their king. And so the United States, instead of entering the war on the side of the French, we actually decided to take a step back. And President George Washington issued the Neutrality Proclamation saying that the United States is not going to get involved in the European conflict. This angered the French, and they saw this as a betrayal of the alliances they made in the past. They believed that the United States was actually siding with Great Britain. The French were also getting more angry because they believed that the United States was not doing enough to repay its debts that it owed to France during the American Revolution. Finally, in 1797, the United States entered into a trade agreement with Great Britain under the terms of Jay's Treaty. After finding out about this, the French ramped up their aggression against the Americans. So much so that by mid-1797, the French had attacked about 300 merchant ships and had declared that any American ships carrying British goods would be seized. They also refused to accept the new American minister that President George Washington sent to France, which was Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. Instead, they threatened him with arrest. The French angered the Americans, especially the Federalist Party, and the two nations seemed to be at the brink of war. So now that we've taken a closer look at the relationship between France and the United States, let's go ahead and look at what was going on in the United States around this time. During the first 8 years of the Constitution and under George Washington's presidency, party politics began to take place. And by the time our second president, John Adams, took office, party politics was strongly in play. They were competing for influence and control of public policy. On one side, we have the Federalist Party, and they were headed by former Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. They were very much for a strong federal government and very much for a strong manufacturing sector, and they were pro-British because the British were an important trading partner who contributed very much to the economic growth of the United States. Now, on the other side, we have the Jeffersonian Republicans, or simply the Republicans, and they were headed by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. The Republican Party supported a weaker central government or weaker federal government and stronger state governments. They were also pro-agriculture and pro-French because France had been our loyal ally during the American Revolution. In 1795, George Washington signed Jay's Treaty in order to prevent war with Great Britain. However, this treaty angered the Republicans and actually the general public. They felt that Jay's Treaty gave up way too much to the British without getting anything much in return. So in 1797, when John Adams became the new president, he inherited all of these problems at home and the increasing tension between France and the United States. So he was one of our most capable and accomplished statesmen at that time. John Adams actually didn't have a lot of experience as an executive. Even though he was now commander-in-chief, he had never served in the military. And as vice president, he only played a minimal role in President George Washington's administration. He also unwittingly decided to keep George Washington's cabinet instead of choosing new men who would be loyal to him. As a result, his cabinet members, who were supposed to be his closest and most trusted advisors, actually saw themselves as independent and were more loyal to party leader Alexander Hamilton than to President John Adams himself. John Adams and Alexander Hamilton did not like each other. Alexander Hamilton was the leader of a faction within the Federalist Party called the High Federalists, and they tended to be more extreme in their support for Britain, whereas John Adams was actually more moderate and tried to come up with bipartisan solutions. In addition, President John Adams, who used to be good friends with his vice president Thomas Jefferson, could not really look to Jefferson for much help since they belonged to two separate parties and they were of a different mind with how the United States should develop. And so keep all of these things in mind as we dive into the XYZ affair. When President John Adams heard that the French refused to accept Charles Pinckney as the new American diplomat to France and actually threatened to arrest him, he was very worried and decided that it was time to call a special session of Congress. So in May 1797, that's exactly what he did. He went to Congress and announced that he intended to send a new American diplomatic mission to France. But at the same time, he asked Congress to beef up their military defenses. So most Federalists responded enthusiastically to this request, especially the military buildup, but the Republicans were enraged. They thought, why are you sending a peacekeeping mission, but at the same time beefing up our military? Do you really intend to have peace with the French, or are you about to wage war with them? Adams also approached his cabinet to talk about who he would send to France to try and negotiate peace. Now, remember, his cabinet members were actually former advisors of President George Washington, who was also a Federalist, and he had chosen very strong Federalists for his cabinet. They tended to lean towards the high Federalist side of the Federalist Party, especially Secretary of State Thomas Pickering, who actually wanted to declare war against France on the side of Great Britain. However, knowing that sending only Federalists would lead to not a lot of compromises, John Adams tried to send some Republicans or independent-minded people to France as well. For example, he toyed with the idea of sending James Madison to France and actually asked Thomas Jefferson to ask James Madison if he would do it. However, his cabinet members were strongly opposed to this idea. John Adams also wanted to send his close friend from Massachusetts, Elbridge Gerry. But again, his cabinet members protested, and they felt that Elbridge Gerry was too independent-minded and was not really a reliable Federalist. However, in the end, John Adams got his way, and he sent Elbridge Gerry as part of the diplomatic mission after congressional approval. He also sent Federalists John Marshall and, of course, Charles Pinckney, who was supposed to be the American diplomat to Paris anyway. So these three American representatives or envoys set off for France in the summer of 1797. Their goal was to meet with the new French foreign minister, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. When they got there, they were actually able to meet him, but only very briefly, for like maybe 15 minutes. The French then made the Americans wait for several days before meeting with them again. And just for a little context, Talleyrand actually didn't need to settle anything in a hurry with the Americans. Remember, France was waging a war and winning all sorts of victories across Europe. Where do you think the young American nation landed on their priority list? Now, here's a really interesting part. There's actually even evidence that Vice President Thomas Jefferson was secretly giving pointers to French diplomats in how they should negotiate with the Americans. The French diplomat to the United States at the time was Philippe Henry Joseph de Lautun. He was residing in America's temporary capital, Philadelphia, along with all the other government officials like Vice President Thomas Jefferson. In some of Lautун's reports to France, he talks about several private meetings he had with Vice President Thomas Jefferson. He reports that Jefferson states that Americans had great gratitude and loyalty towards the French people, and it was President John Adams and the Federalists who were a problem. He said that John Adams was a vain and stubborn man, but don't worry, he only won the presidency by 3 votes and he won't be president for long. So all the French needed to do was be patient to receive the American envoys with whatever respect or dignity is appropriate, but to drag out the negotiations for as long as possible. He was hoping that This would give enough time for France to actually invade Great Britain, which was the last holdout in Europe at the time against the French. And by then, the Federalists would be forced to give more concessions and maintain peace with France. So, whether it was because of Jefferson or not, Talleyrand did drag out negotiations with the Americans and actually refused to meet them himself. Instead, he sent different informal representatives to meet with the American envoys over a period of several months. First, they were approached by Baron John Conrad Hottinger and Pierre Bellamy. They would later become known as X and Y in the whole XYZ affair. They assured the Americans that France looked favorably towards the United States. However, in order to meet officially with Talleyrand again, they needed to pay Talleyrand about $250,000 for him to use personally. In addition, they had to lend the French government a low-interest loan of a considerable amount of money as payback for John Adams' speech in May 1797 in front of Congress, which they considered as very insulting. So yes, this request for a bribe is very dishonorable, especially in the eyes of the Americans at that time, but it was actually common European practice. Talleyrand himself had actually accumulated a lot of wealth as French foreign minister by asking for bribes from other countries. Anyway, of course, the Americans refused to pay such a large bribe without any guarantees that any talks they would have with Talleyrand would result in benefits for the United States. Next, a man named Lucien Hotteval approached Elbridge Gerry privately, who would later become known as Z in XYZ. He assured Gerry that France is friendly towards the United States and that they would not be disappointed if they went ahead and paid the bribe. Finally, Hottinger and Bellamy approached the Americans once again and tried to convince them to pay up for the bribe. But this time, they reminded the Americans of the power and violence of the French. This was basically a threat of war, and this insulted and angered the Americans, and Charles Pinckney famously said, "No, no, not a sixpence." So to report what was happening, John Marshall sent 5 coded letters to John Adams. The letters arrived in the United States on March 4th, 1798. It took a few days to decode them, but by the time John Adams had figured everything out, he was really angered, of course, and he went back and forth thinking to himself of whether he should declare war with France or try to maintain the peace. Later that month, he let Congress know that the diplomatic mission to France had failed, and he asked Congress for more armaments, but he didn't tell them anything about what was inside John Marshall's letters. He knew that revealing details too soon might actually endanger the lives of the American diplomats in France. In addition, he knew that there would be great outrage and it would definitely bring us closer to war. However, the Republicans in Congress were enraged that John Adams was not revealing the details of the letters. They thought that John Adams actually really wanted war and that there wasn't really any valid excuse for him to ask for more armaments, and that's why he was hiding the details inside those letters. So, a month later, the Republicans were successful in passing a motion in Congress to force President John Adams to reveal the contents of the letters. John Adams did so a day later. However, when he revealed the letters to Congress, he made sure that the names of the French agents were blocked out and replaced with the letters XYZ. And that's why we know this whole thing as the XYZ Affair. Anyway, everyone was shocked and outraged, and in particular, the Republicans were embarrassed by the shameful behavior of the French agents. Only the most loyal pro-French Republicans tried to defend the French. For example, Benjamin Franklin Bache, the editor of the newspaper Aurora, blamed John Adams for sending incompetent people who were unwilling to negotiate and compromise for peace. But this opinion was not popular with the public. As a result of the letters, Congress, but with resistance from Jeffersonian Republicans, went ahead and voted to prepare for war and give President John Adams whatever he asked for. They activated a trade embargo against France and canceled all treaties between the two countries. They allowed American naval ships to go ahead and attack any French ships they found in the high seas, harassing American merchant ships. Congress also greatly expanded the Navy and created the Department of the Navy, which was then separate from the War Department. Congress also called for a 10,000 men standing army, which was way more than what John Adams had asked for. And then John Adams convinced President George Washington to come out of retirement and head this new army. George Washington then chose Alexander Hamilton to be his second in command. Alexander Hamilton went into a flurry of war preparations and pushed for a war against France, and actually convinced members of John Adams's cabinet to try and push the president towards that route. However, President John Adams resisted asking Congress for a declaration of war and continued to look for ways to maintain peace. In June of that year, while all of this was going on, John Adams received a disturbing letter from William Vance Murray. William Vance Murray was the American diplomat to the Netherlands at this time, and William Vance Murray told John Adams in the letter that John Marshall and Charles Pinckney were able to leave France. However, Elbridge Gerry stayed behind. Why would he stay behind? This worried and disappointed John Adams, because the only possible explanation seemed to be that Gerry was beguiled by Talleyrand and that he may end up betraying the United States. Gerry, who was John Adams's close friend and the person that he trusted the most among the three American envoys. However, a few days later, John Marshall arrived in the United States. He met with John Adams and assured John Adams that actually Gerry stayed because Talleyrand had threatened that there would be war between the United States if Elbridge Gerry did not stay. And so, as an act of courage and patriotism, Gerry decided to stay in Paris. But he refused to negotiate any longer with Talleyrand. Finally, Gerry himself arrives in October, and he meets with Adams and reassures him that France does not want a war with the United States, and that actually, if we were to send another peacekeeping envoy, that they would be received with respect and dignity this time. This was later corroborated by William Vance Murray in the Netherlands, and Talleyrand himself sent a letter addressed to John Adams saying that he was ready to negotiate once again. And whatever new American diplomats the United States sends to France would be received with respect. So with these reassurances, John Adams sent a new American peacekeeping envoy to France in 1799. They successfully hammered out a peace treaty with the French. However, it did not reach the United States until after John Adams had lost the presidential election of 1800. So before we conclude this video, I want us to reflect, and I want to present to you some quotes from George Washington's farewell address. Against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, I conjure you to believe me, fellow citizens, the jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of the Republican government. Real patriots who may resist the intrigues of the favorite are liable to become suspected and odious, while its tools and dupes usurp the applause and confidence of the people to surrender their interests. George Washington was warning here against the dangers of foreign countries and their efforts to influence the American people. By tools and dupes, he's talking about American individuals in the United States who allow themselves to be manipulated by their favoritism of foreign countries. And here perhaps he's talking about Republicans like Jefferson and Madison. And look at what Thomas Jefferson did, right? These individuals might appear to be acting in the interests of the people and maybe even convince themselves that they are. But in reality, they're actually giving up American interests for benefits of other countries. Then he talks about the baneful effects of the spirit of party and how party politics can actually be easily used by foreign powers to manipulate and undermine the American people. He states that it, meaning the spirit of party, serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which find a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passion. Thus, the policy and the will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. And actually, I don't mean to be unfair, because it wasn't just Thomas Jefferson. I mean, look at the behavior of Alexander Hamilton. He was secretly trying to manipulate John Adams through his own cabinet members and pushing towards war. But was war actually what was good for the United States at this time? So with the way the typical textbooks explain the XYZ affair, it seems to make it that the French were the villains, those bribe-seeking French guys. But how villainous is it if it was common European practice? And how can we evaluate the XYZ affair in light of George Washington's prophetic farewell address? Who were actually the main drivers of this conflict? How could things have been different if party spirit hadn't been so strong and vicious inside Congress and inside John Adams's cabinet? I mean, I don't know, maybe this was the best result. Were there foreign agents manipulating Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, or did they make up their own minds? Whose actions and what events brought us closer to this potentially calamitous and expensive war against France? In all this, there's John Adams. He resisted pressure and endured insults from both political parties. He was degraded and insulted by the Jeffersonian Republicans for his efforts to arm the United States. Then he angered his own Federalist party, who wanted to actually go into war with France, by continuing to pursue peace and sending diplomatic missions to Paris. In addition to fielding party pressure in Congress, John Adams was greatly undermined by his own cabinet, who kept pushing for war, but John Adams resolutely kept his eyes on peace. He rose above party lines and tried to send bipartisan representation to France. However, he did not neglect American defense. He went ahead and built up the Navy so much so that he became known as the father of the U.S. Navy. But all these accomplishments, you will see, will be overshadowed by the calamitous Alien and Sedition Acts, which is what we'll be talking about in our next video. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope this has been helpful to you. I'll see you all next time.